Good morning, gang. Welcome to the next video in the men's tailoring installment on making a frock coat. Today I am going to show you how to construct the sleeves and make the cuffs. I have them all cut out here and we'll get started shortly. My name is Kelly Grant. I am head tailor and dressmaker at Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing. Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing. Yeah, and I'm working through how to make a men's frock coat from the late 18th century. 1768, 9-ish, actually. So just before the American Revolution. Today we're working on sleeves. Lovely sleeve. And I have the sleeves, the two layers of fashion layer stitched together and the two layers of linen lining stitched together. I didn't think you guys needed me to stitch for you on the camera. It was just put right sides together and back stitch the seam, press the seam allowances open. I've covered that in the other installments. And I want to get straight to the brass tacks of sleeve construction. So, without further ado, there's my fashion sleeve, complete with fuzz. There's my linen sleeve. And wrong sides together, I'm going to slide my linen sleeve inside my wool sleeve. And I'm going to match up the front and back sleeve seams. And down here at the bottom, I'm going to match up the edges at the cuff. And the seam lines perfectly. And pin them. And I'm going to put a cuff on this, so this whole endeavor is going to be covered anyway, and you won't see all of these raw edges. So now what I'm going to do, because I've matched up my seam allowances and those sleeve pieces are the same size, but one is inside the other, you're going to have to pop the wool. And by popping, I mean pull the wool so that you're not stitching in a bubble in the lining. You're kind of easing the two together to fit, or popping the two together to fit. So I'm taking my two seam allowances and pulling and then pinning the middle, pulling and pinning the middle. And pulling and pinning in the middle. And you're pulling just enough to create a little bit of ease there. Now, what I want you to do is 1/4 of an inch in from that cut edge, baste those two together. And you can do that by hand with just a basting stitch, or you can do it by machine. So there's my basted edge. And honestly, just do it by machine if you have access to a sewing machine, because nobody is going to see that once the garment is done. Nobody at all. It's going to be totally encased in the cuff. Now, a bit of a tailoring trick to get your lining to stay in place where you want it to stay after years of putting on and removing your coat is to stitch the seam allowances of your back seam together. And what I'm going to do is make sure my seam allowances are matched up there. Also that I don't have a twist in the sleeve lining, because that would be horrible. So I've matched up my my seam allowances, and I'm holding them together at the top, and then I'm going to go down and pick up just the seam allowances inside, and I'm going to baste the two seam allowances together just on one of those seam allowances. So the seam allowances are flat. You can kind of sort of see them there. Flat together, wrong sides together, and I'm just picking up the seam allowance, and for about 3 inches there, I'm going to sew those together. And there you can see the seam allowances stitched together, and I'm far enough down from the top edge that that's not going to mess at all with me sewing the sleeve in or anything like that. It's just going to hold the sleeve lining from sliding down the coat. If you've ever seen a coat where the cuff lining is falling out, it's because that little step was either not done or it's come undone. And again, it's not ever going to be seen by anyone, so just do it by machine. There, your two sleeves are finished and ready for the next step. I'm going to set them aside and work on cuffs. There's my cuffs that I'm going to be putting on the bottom of the sleeve, and this is my cuff lining. I'm just going to double check to see that the cuff is actually going to fit the end of the sleeve. And because I want the cuff seam to be at the back, just gonna set my sleeve in there. I'm just pinning this in place so I can see how big it's going to be. And I'm going to mark the seam allowance. And mark the seam allowance. I'm going to take my pins out so I can set my sleeve aside. And I'll do that with the other one too, just to make sure that everything is sitting properly. Now, because I know that this pin down here is where my seam allowance is on my cuff coat, I'm going to mark that with a piece of chalk. Mark the other side with a piece of chalk. Take my straight pins out. Mark my line. That's my sewing line. My sewing line. And then I'm going to cut my seam allowances. And you want to double check this so that you're not making your cuffs too big or too small for the sleeve ends. I just cut roughly, knowing that I would be doing this. I also am noticing that I'm a little tall on one side than I am on the other. So I'm just going to measure that properly. And true up that line. Yeah, that's out quite a bit, isn't it? I'm raw edging this one, so I don't need to add seam allowance. Here we go. Taking the time to true up that edge now is going to make things so much easier in the future. Now, what I'm going to do with this sleeve is have a built-in facing that's going to go up inside the sleeve so that when the wearer is wearing said sleeve and he holds his coat up, that edge is going to be seen as black and not the natural linen. Just truing up my seam allowances there. And because I now know how big the cuff needs to be, I can cut the seam allowance. And now what I'm going to do is fold under that top edge and press it down so that I have a nice folded edge to fell to the top edge of my cuff. That's not the nicest line I've ever cut. Trimming it up a bit more. Could be making it worse. Who's to say? It'll look nice when it's all done. Okay, so before we stitch those two pieces together, I'm going to want to actually make up my cuff. This is going to make it easier to get a nice clean top edge of my cuff when I go to sew my lining in. And with a knotted thread, I'm going to backstitch the cuff seam allowances together, right sides together. You could also do this by machine if you were under a time crunch. Just lengthen your stitch length to 3 millimeters. Because 3 millimeters is more in keeping with what a hand stitch length should be, especially with wool. Now getting close to the edge, the top edge there that I want it to be almost as perfect as possible, I'm just being really careful to scotch those two edges together and make my knot in the top. And because I don't want to be dealing with that tail of the thread when I go to the next step, I'm going to bury it in the between, well, in one of the seam allowances, in between the fibers of one of the seam allowances. So here's 1/2 cuff made. Set that aside for a second. Now I'm going to sew my cuff lining together. I'm going to bury my tail of my thread in between the fold. Do a couple of back stitches there. And quickly sew this seam allowance together. There's going to be no structural integrity needed for this cuff lining, so I'm just doing a running stitch with an odd back stitch every so often. Now, some of you are going to ask why I'm not using linen thread. When I am sewing such fine cloth, I tend to sew with silk thread. Wool is one of those cloths that really deserve a little bit extra. And superfine, I'm sorry, is so nice that sewing with silk thread is far superior to my hand than sewing with linen thread. If I was making a working coat, like a sailor's coat or a farmer's coat, and I was wanting it to not really appear, but be a bit more hard wearing and have the ability to, as we say with horses, ride them hard and put them away wet, I might use linen thread. But I tend to use linen thread on linen garments and silk thread on wool garments. I also use silk thread on garments that I really need a fine thread for. So it's using the materials that you have at hand, but also in the appropriate setting. So there's my seam allowances all made. Most important tool in the studio is your iron. Use it. It's really hard to press a garment entirely once it's been made up, but if you press a little as you go, the garment is going to look really lovely at the end. Also, clip your threads. Okay, so there's my cuff all made up. There's my cuff lining all made up. I'm going to insert one in the other, like a little burrito. I'm going to match up my seam allowances. So that my seam is on my seam. Now I'm going to pop it like I did before and pin the other side. And pop and pin and pop and pin. And you definitely want to use pins when you're sewing it around like this. If you don't, once you get to the other end of your seam, you may find out that you have eased one edge in a little bit further than the other when it took you 2 minutes to pin that seam together. Now, starting at that seam, I'm going to come up and bury my thread between the 2 layers and fell stitch the lining to the cuff. And as I'm felling, I'm scotching that seam allowance of the cuff lining into place so you won't see it. I'm sewing pretty close to the pin and then removing the pin as I go around. And now that we're back around, I'm smooshing that seam allowance inside between the cuff layers so that the cotton seam allowances are not showing. And we've gotten all the way around and no bubble at the end. And I can knot it off. Perfect time for the thread to break. With just enough of a tail to knot. And then burying the tail in between the layers of cuff. Now, my cuff ends about there. And I need enough to fold up underneath the edge of the seam, or the bottom of the sleeve, rather. So I'm going to trim away my excess sleeve cuff lining. You can see it right there, kinda. So what I'm going to do now is fold up how much I want to trim off so that I have enough to come up inside. Because what I want is the cuff lining to be stitched to the bottom of the sleeve, and then the cuff itself to encase that raw edge. So I'm thinking a fine inch there. And so that I have a cutting line, I'm just going to slightly press that in place. So that now I have a line to follow. Now, taking my sleeve cuff, or the end of my sleeve, and the cuff, and matching up the back seam, because I want that back seam to match up with the back seam. I'm going to make another burrito. And I'm going to match up that lining with my seam allowance. So I'm matching up the cuff lining seam allowance with the seam allowance of my sleeve end. I kind of don't really need the cuff in place right now. It's just getting in the way. And again, because I want to ease those two pieces together, I'm going to pop and pin. It's rush hour here in Carlton Corner. You can hear all the traffic going by. Okay, now that I have my cuff lining pinned to my sleeve end, I have a stitching line right there that I'm going to follow. I'm going to stitch these two pieces together. You could do this by machine. Certainly if you had black thread in your machine. I don't at the moment, so I'm just doing it by hand. And this is not really going to take any serious wear and tear, so I'm just going to use a short running stitch with a few back stitches as I need them. You could even use a spaced back stitch if you wanted to, but it's really not going to take any stress, so there's no need to over-engineer it. Remember to pull your pins out before you pull your thread up tight, because if there's a straight pin in the way, it will cause your stitch to bubble. Going over all those seam allowances, it's sometimes faster to just do a back stitch. Not that I'm over engineering anything, it's just faster. Ouch, stab your thumb. And I'm going to knot off my thread. And run the tail in between the layers. And there's what the seam looks like. And it's just there to hold the lining in place. Okay. Want my cuff to lay nice and flat and in the right spot. I'm going to take my seam allowance of my cuff, and you can see that I bled on the coat a little bit. And I'm going to tuck that thread in. If it'll stay, there we go. Now, all I'm doing is, see that raw edge? I'm just folding right on that raw edge the cuff to the inside. And I'm going to pin it in place. And then I'm going to go over to the other side, opposite the seam, and fold that edge over and pin it in place. And then once again, popping and pinning. And I want to make sure all of those seam allowances are nice and flat inside. So that's what the inside of the cuff looks like. And now with a fresh bit of thread, starting at the seam, because we want that seam to lay flat, and I want all my threads nicely tucked inside. I'm now going to backstitch that cuff lining in place, going through a couple of layers, but not all of the layers. And the back stitches are going to be spaced. They're not going to be one on top of the other. Usually it's Bear that's got the snore on, but today it's Duff. You can hear him in the background. And again, I'm stitching up to the straight pin before pulling it out, because I don't want the seam to creep. This is a bit difficult to do for me to show you guys. But if you know how to do a back stitch, you know what I'm doing here on the camera. And I'm being careful not to go through all of the layers. Because I don't want the seam to show on the outside of the cuff. Now, certainly you could have kept the lining of the sleeve free and then brought the lining down and slip stitched it to this cuff. That's another option that you could have done. This is just one of the options. And since it's super fine and not ever going to fray, and I'm getting back around to the other side where I started. I'm going to make my knot in line with my stitching so it kind of disappears. And then I'm going to hide the tail of my stitching in between the layers. There's one sleeve made. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other one. Okay, folks, here I have my finished sleeve. All lovely and beautiful, complete with nice cuff. Both of them are done. Now, to prepare the sleeve for setting in the arm side of the coat, I have run a easing stitch on the machine at a 5mm stitch length. And now what I'm going to do is pull on the bobbin thread to make the sleeve head cup. And you want this so that the sleeve head can fit over your shoulder bone and the arm can hang in your sleeve without it pulling the sleeve pulling the jacket off your body. If you don't have ease in there, then the garment is never going to sit right on the body. It's always going to pull off. Now, I've cupped that quite a bit. I probably won't need that much. But if I did have to ease that much into the arm side of the sleeve, I could steam out some of those puckers. And I'll do that by just pointing the iron. And it takes a bit of work and a bit of steam. And just going in and steaming out those puckers a little bit. And you don't want to go any further than this, because you don't want to steam out all the ease in your sleeve. You just want to steam out those puckers. Because you want that top of your sleeve to cup over your shoulder. And how much you can ease in totally depends on the wool or the fabric that you're using. I can ease in a fair amount even on a taffeta, which is a hard fabric to ease. But that's what you want it to look like on the outside. You want it to cup. Can you see that cup? And it'll roll like that if you've done it properly. Okay. Tucking that lining out of the way, because I'm not going to deal with that just yet. I'm going to take the body of the coat trim off some of this excess seam allowance I got going on here. let's throw some basting on there to hold everything together. Now on the body of the coat, I'm holding all 3 layers together. And I'm in far enough away that my basting is not going to be affected by stitching the sleeve on. But I'm capturing all of the layers of the body of the coat. There. Trim that extra thread. Now, see all this extra stuff? I can trim it off in line with the wool of my coating. True up that seam a little bit. There we go. Now we're ready to set the sleeve. Get rid of that trash. Okay. Trying to get this lined up so you can see what I'm talking about here. This is the lower arm side. I'm going to match the sleeve with the lower arm side through the inside of the coat. And usually the curves line up perfectly, and it's just going to tell you where you need it to be. But also, if you've got a good draft, the back seam of the sleeve is going to usually match up with the shoulder seam of the coat, because they're both on an angle, right? So I'm starting at that back sleeve seam and the shoulder seam, and I'm pinning the bottom of the arm side in first. And I always pin the bottom of the arm side in first. Until I get up to the easing point of the top of the sleeve. Take off that little bit of extra seam allowance hanging out there. Okay. So now you've got the top of the sleeve and the top of the arm side. There we go. And it's just going to sit in there where it wants to sit. And you're going to want a little bit more ease, usually sitting towards the back of the body than the front of the body, because most people carry the weight of their body and their arms and their shoulder point a little bit further back on the body than they do on the front. So that's kind of where that top of the sleeve wants to sit. I'm making sure I've got enough ease in the front that I'm not pulling it. And I'm just going to pin it in place. Now, here's a trick. When you're easing in something that's bigger than another something, put the bigger thing on the top and kind of work the ease over your fingers like this. And by working the bigger into the smaller, the ease is a bit more controllable. And yeah, I'm using pins. I'm just going to smooth that ease out evenly and pinning it in place. Now, if you had the luxury, the next step would be to baste this sleeve in and to have a fitting. I don't have the luxury of a fitting, so I'm going to sew in this armhole. And I'm going to use a machine because I can. I don't need to waste my hand sewing on this step. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start back here at that back shoulder, back seam, and then go around the bottom, and then very carefully stitch the top. Now, because of the way that I'm going to be stitching, the easing piece is going to be on the top of my machine. And I'm going to very carefully pull that way on the ease. So I'm going to pull it like this as it's going through the machine. And I'm going to sew straight up to the needle, stop, take the needle out. So up to the needle, stop, take the needle out. I'm not going to backstitch between. I'm just going to sew up to the needle and take it out, up to the needle and take it out, all the way around so that I know that that sleeve has been eased in properly. So I'm going to do that and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so my sleeve is now stitched in and it's cupping really, really well. But it's got a little bit of a bubble there. So I'm going to steam it a bit more. This will also flatten out as the client wears the garment, especially if it's a warm, moist day and they are being warm and damp in the garment. Because wool does that. It conforms to the body. So does linen. But I'm just going to help it along a little bit. Yeah, that's better. As I wiggle the camera all to pieces. And I should be happy with it now. I'll turn it to the right side to see. There we go. See how it's cupping over like that? We want that. See that nice little cup there? Nice roll line. That's probably one of the nicest sleeves I put in one go in a long time. Okay, now to finish off the inside, because, you know, we want all of this finished off, right? I'm going to, because I've stitched those seam allowances together, I'm going to follow the seam allowance up and then take the lining and fold it over so that it looks like that. See, I folded over the seam allowance and I've put it in place. And because I stitched the seam allowances of the back seam together, it just goes where it wants to go. And all the way around the bottom of the arm, I'm going to pin the lining in place. And I'm being careful not to pull it because the lining is entirely on the bias around that armhole. Armholes are not cut on the straight at all. And I've got a big boobo there that I'm going to cut off because I can. And I'm just folding under my seam allowance. Not really anything more than that. Just folding under a 1/2 inch. And seeing where it wants to sit. And pinning it in place. Now you'll notice that I pin perpendicular to my seams. If I was to pin this way, that would ease a lot of the lining into the coat as I was pinning. And this way I have more control over how much ease I'm adding into that seam. Because depending on where it is, I may not want to add any ease at all. Okay, now that I've got my bottom of my armhole done, I'm going to come up and see where the top of that armhole is by pulling it up and pinning it in place. Now, I should be able to ease the rest of the arm saw in place with my straight pins and pinning the little bubbles in like that all the way around. And yeah, I want those bubbles because I want the ease on the top of the sleeve head, just like the underside. And you'll see how I take care of them in just a minute. So, you can see all of those bubbles there? Those will all be eased into place. For this seam, I'm using a heavier thread. You could use a buttonhole twist, you could use a linen. I'm using an extra strong buttonhole thread. And I've got enough to go around the whole arm saw in a bit. Now, just like before, I'm going to sew in my lower arm side first, which means I'm starting at the seam there to go around the lower arm side, and I'm going to use a whip stitch. And the whip stitch is like making little sevens. And I actually want to be able to see the stitches, so I'm not coming up right on the fold. I'm coming up. I don't know if you can see that. I'm coming up, taking a stitch and coming up in from the fold. And right now, because I'm going around the lower arm side, I'm pulling away from the seam fairly straightly. So I will get around to the top side and I will show you what I'm doing next. And I am only taking the lining fabric. I'm not going through the body of the coat. And I'm sewing right along that. You can barely see the stitching line. I'm matching up the fold of my sleeve lining to that stitching line. This is my very favorite seam in the whole coat, because when you get it right, it is sexy. And nobody gets to see it because it's in your armpit. One of the jobs I had when I was a student was taking apart old tuxedos to put smaller shoulder pads in them. And I had to take apart this beautifully made seam on probably about 50 tuxedos and redo the shoulder pads and put the pads back in and then redo the sleeve. And once this sleeve seam is done, those little stitches make little furrows in the linen. And one of the things that I tested myself with was to be able to copy the stitches of the tailors that made the coats originally, so that you couldn't see where my stitching was from the old one, unless you were looking really closely and could tell that it was new thread. Yeah, I'm a nerd. Copying old tailor stitches, though, is a lot like students when they copied old masters' paintings. You can learn a lot by trying to make it look like it was there all along. And this linen is such a dream to work with because it's so nice and crisp. Okay, now I'm getting up to where I'm going to start easing in the top of the arm side or the sleeve head. Let's see if I can get this coat around so that you guys can see what I'm doing and I'm not fighting it. Okay, back here where I was doing this one, I was pulling in that direction, perpendicular to my sleeve seam. Now that I'm going to start easing, I'm going to take a stitch on an angle with the sleeve seam, and I'm going to pull backwards. So I'm going to take a stitch on an angle and pull backwards. And what that's going to do is ease in the sleeve head of the lining ever so slightly with each stitch. And you're going to work by moving the cloth with your thumb and easing it in with your thumb and by pulling the stitch back. And you're going to have to remove pins before you get to this stage, because the garment's going to want to ease up. And you're going to futz with it. It's just a matter of futzing until you're happy with it. And if it means taking the thread out and redoing the stitches until you're happy with it, it's just thread. And we're getting close to back into that lower arm side again. And I'm not having to ease as much. So I'm going to change the angle of the stitching again. And the angle of the pull. And then when I'm at the bottom, or at the starting point again, I'm going to make a knot. Just one knot, please. Not two. Now I'm going to make a second knot. There we go. And bury the end of my thread. Now, some days this seam is going to be sexier than others, but look at that. Isn't that sexy? And that's what the top looks like. All eased in. And then double check all the way around the outside of your arm side to make sure that you haven't stitched through with white thread onto your dark cloth. And that sleeve is done. I'll do the other one. And then in the next video, we will tackle finishing this coat. Okay. If you like what you see, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And that dingly bell over here, it actually works. Even at 3 in the morning when the videos go live. Okay, it is now getting dark and I am about finished for the day. I hope you have a great day and happy stitching.